Okay. Okay. Good evening. This is a Special Ed Parent Advisory Committee presentation for the Denville Township Schools, and I'm Grace Johnson, the Director of Special Services for Denville, and I am presenting along with
my name is Michelle Pupachich. I am a parent member of the SEPAC committee, but I was also a case manager for 8 years.
Thank you. So tonight we are presenting on the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of IEPs and 504s. We're really hoping to give you a detailed, informative overview of the IEP process, which is the Individualized Education Program process for students who qualify for special education. And we're also going to go into the difference between that and a 504 accommodation plan. So we hope you will find this presentation very informative. And just so you know, if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, you can access the slides for this presentation. And if you look in the comments section below, you'll see information on how to access those slides on our website. So we're going to get started here. So this is a diagram of the overall process. So we're going to take you through this process tonight. Basically, the steps that you would go through if a child is referred for special education, to be evaluated for special education. So you would start with the referral process. We're going to take you through that, the evaluation, finding a student eligible for services, the actual IEP document, which will be a big portion of the presentation, and what goes into all of that and how it's reviewed. So for the referral process, a student may be referred to the child study team by anyone. So the parent could refer a student to the child study team, a teacher, or an administrator. When a child is struggling and there's a belief that the student might need special education, that's when a referral would take place. And that referral will come to the Director of Special Services here in Denville. And once we receive that referral, then the CST will schedule a meeting with the student's parents and teachers within 20 school days. So that's the first part of the process.
So once that referral letter has come in and a meeting has been scheduled, these will be the participants of who would be attending. So the student's parents would be attending, members of the child study team. So learning consultant, school psychologist, and school social worker encompasses the team. The student's current general education teacher, and any other relevant staff member. So if that particular child is participating in basic skills instruction, or if they're seeing the guidance counselor, they may be involved in that meeting as well to gather all the information necessary. So what happens at this meeting? All attendees will discuss the student's strengths, progresses and weaknesses, and areas of concerns, as well as any interventions that have been put into place at that time. After the discussion, work samples, questions, etc., the CST will determine whether or not they suspect a disability and if there's an educational impact. If they believe so, then they will, if they suspect a disability and that there's educational impact, the CST will explain whether evaluations are warranted, and if so, what evaluations will be conducted at that time. Some examples can be your educational, so mathematics, reading portion, so forth. Your psychological, which is your IQ, a social history, which is childbirth and things of that nature. Some other assessments can be your speech and language assessment, functional behavioral assessment. Kind of, it all depends on the information that's presented at the meeting at that time and what's relevant. The CST will then ask for parental consent to proceed with the evaluations. Now, no evaluations can be conducted without parental consent. Now, once the CST receives parental consent, the evaluation process begins. And so from the day of the consent, the district has 90 calendar days to complete the evaluations, write the reports, schedule a meeting, and provide the parent with the reports within 10 days prior to the eligibility meeting.
Okay. So after all of that process takes place, the reports have been sent home to the parents. You have a chance to review the reports and make note of any questions you might have, and then you will come back to meet with the team that conducted the evaluations. And you will meet with, your teacher will be there. If your child is eligible for special education, a special education teacher will join the team. if any type of related services were evaluated. For example, if your child was evaluated by a speech therapist or an occupational therapist, they might be there to go over their test results and answer your questions. And so you'll have that opportunity to discuss and to determine if your child is eligible. So at that point, the CST determines that and discusses that with you. And there are 14 possible categories that the state has outlined for districts as to whether or not a child would be eligible for services. So we have them all listed here on this presentation or on your slides that you printed out. So there's 14 categories, like I said. And I'm just going to give you a little overview of the current types of classifications we have here in Denville. So out of those 14, the highest proportion tends to be in specific learning disability, with 40% of eligible students falling under that category. So when you're finding out if a child is eligible, there's just very specific criteria that the test results will fall under, and that's at that point where you would determine which of these categories a student would fall under. And if they fall under one of those categories and they need special education services, that's when you would find them eligible. And at that point, that's when we would be proposing a program for your child. And that process, again, the parent is always involved in that process. So once you're determining what types of services your child needs, you're a part of that process. And you're developing the IEP with the team. So we're going to move forward into the actual process and what the document looks like, where you outline all of the components of a student's program. And I'm just going to go through this is actually a sample of what our IEPs look like in Denville. It's blank, there's no information in there, but that would all be filled in based on the student and their needs. And again, this is available through the handout that you can access on our website. The front page of an IEP will have all the identifying information about the student's name, their date of birth. It'll have all the information about the current meeting. It will have what type of meeting that you're having, because these IEPs are reviewed each year. So is it a yearly review, or is this the first time you're ever creating an IEP? It will explain all of that on there. Everything is spelled out in the IEP. It'll also discuss what eligibility of those eligibility categories the student is in, and a summary of all the programs and services. So we'll go more in depth into that as we go through the document.
So the next portion of the IEP is the actual participation page. So it would indicate, if the student is participating, if they're older, they may be participating with the parents, the general education teacher, special education teacher, child study team members, case manager, if there's a school district representative, and and other participants, like I said, student or OT or speech, and they would sign off on that. These sections here indicate the evaluations and reports. So just a basic summary up on top of the evaluations and the reports that you've already received, as a parent has already received copies of. Down here, the section would be any kind of assessments, such as Mount Park, for statewide and district assessments, and that would be for your older students, not necessarily a little guy. So then if the students, the section here would be the standardized test results. So if they had a psychological, it would indicate the IQ score. If there was an educational, it would indicate the breakdown of mathematics and so forth on top. There's also a section for the strength of the student. So, it would describe, as an example here, socially Johnny works well with his peers in the area of mathematics. He has mastered his addition and subtraction math facts 1 to 10, just to kind of give you an example of that. And then there's a portion on the bottom of any concern that a parent may have that should be documented in an IEP. So an example of that would be Mr. and Mrs. Jones are concerned with Johnny's slow progress in reading. That would be a potential concern of the parent. You want to have that documented. next sections on top is the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. This section is completed by the therapist, by the general education teacher, the special education teacher, and it's basically, as it says, they're just what their performance is at that point in time. And it also includes an eligibility statement, the reason why they're eligible, and the summaries, as I indicated. And then this section on the bottom indicates how the disability affects the student. So just a statement explaining how the student's disability affects his or her progress in the general education setting. And then you have several sections here. Is your, child an ELL learner? Is English their second language? Are there communication needs, such as speech services? Is there a behavior plan? Assistive technology, consultating with agencies. Are they deaf or hard of hearing, or blind or visually impaired? So all these points would be checked off and then explained further if it is a yes.
Okay, so another portion of the IEP focuses specifically on transition and planning for a student's transition. This process starts beginning of the year when a child will turn 14. So this is talking about how are we planning to prepare a student for once they're completing high school and moving on to their post-secondary goals. So that process is all outlined in an IEP. You focus on the student's strengths, their interests and preferences, and that's all documented here. And for example, are they likely interested in pursuing college versus are they looking to obtain a job after they graduate? And at this point, once they turn 14, they're also invited to the IEP meeting and they're part of this team with you. The courses of study that the student will be taking in the year they turn 14 and through high school are outlined, and any strategies that need to be put in place to achieve their goals. For example, are they participating in any extracurricular activities? What types of activities do we need to put into place in addition to just their core academic courses to prepare them for when they graduate? There's a portion here where we might be consulting with agencies who are going to assist with that planning process. For example, there's the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. They'll do assessments to determine types of needs, occupational needs a student might have. The post-secondary goals are more detailed in the IEP when your child turns 16. So with that process, you're really getting much more detailed. You're moving much closer to when they'll be graduating high school, so you want to make sure that each year is planned out to prepare for that transition. So it's a multi-year plan, and it outlines activities and strategies, the start dates for those different activities and strategies. Maybe some things are going to take place when they're freshmen. Maybe when they're freshmen, they're taking a career survey, but then once they're moving on to later years, they're doing, maybe they're getting coached on a job. It depends on the student's need, or maybe it's just making sure that they're taking the right courses for college at the right times. It's a shared responsibility developing this multi-year plan. Students involved, the parents involved, school staff, outside agencies, like I said, DVR, for example, and employers might all be participating in this process, depending on the student's individual needs. The next section of the IEP is behavioral interventions. So if a student happens to be having some challenging behaviors that are interfering with their learning, you can detail a behavior plan in the IEP. And that plan will list the target behavior. I gave the example if the student was calling out a lot in class and it was disruptive to the student's learning. And the traditional intervention of perhaps a classroom behavior system that was all students were following was not working, then we would pursue some type of more individualized intervention and outline it here. And that evaluation plan should be evaluated regularly to make sure it's effective. And just like every other part of this process, the parent is involved in this plan. For example, it might be you're given progress reports on how the student's doing, or maybe you want to implement similar techniques in your home. Those would all be things that could be discussed in this portion of an IEP meeting and then be put into effect.
The next portion is progress reporting. So you'll be receiving, as a parent, progress reports, usually coinciding with report cards. So it could be 4 times a year or 3 times a year. And this is basically indicating how your student is doing, how your child is doing. It'll indicate specific goals. Grace? Okay. Thanks. No, that's okay. Thank you. So anyway, so as I was saying, specific goals are made in the IEP to see where the student is at and what they can achieve. And they're working towards their goals and objectives. So for example, a goal has to be measurable. So an example of that would be Johnny would, will recognize numerals from 0 to 31, because that's an attainable goal. And they'll have, the rates and the success rates. And this could be through test scores, through classroom observations, and review of progress reports. And the goals are evaluated to see if they're working or not, if they need to be altered or whatnot. The next portion is modifications in the general education classroom and or special education classroom. So some of the examples of those are giving a student extra time on tests or extra time on assignments. Modify tests, maybe they need a word bank. Clarify, repeat, reword directions, checking for understanding. Those are just some examples of modifying assignments in the classroom. Supplemental aids and services is a little bit different. This could be if a child is receiving OT and they need a sensory diet, or they're having trouble with their writing, they need a graphic organizer, reading windows, so forth, behavior chart. That would be your supplemental aids and services. On the bottom, it's assistive technology, and assistive technologies can be books on tape, calculators, or alternative augmentative communication.
So, after you've considered all of those techniques and strategies and modifications for a student, you then have to consider types of programs the student might need to meet those different goals and objectives that you've outlined in the IEP. And in Denville and across the state, we strive to provide a continuum of programs for students. The least restrictive environment would be a general education classroom. So whenever possible, that's where we would hope to provide the services for the student. But there are other options as well, and if a student needs more individualized attention and support to meet the goals, then we're going to look at what other services can we provide. Do they need another teacher in the classroom to provide specialized techniques and additional instruction? Do they need to be pulled out for certain subjects to give them that support? Do they need to be in a classroom that's separate for a significant portion of the day, where it's a smaller group, more intense environment, and perhaps they're getting mainstreamed in general education settings for socialization or as they are ready? So we offer the range here, and that process of the IEP team collaborating and determining what the student needs will determine what program winds up in the IEP. So this is an example of a special education program, and if you look at the sample IEP, you can see this page there. For example, a student's program might be a pull-out resource replacement. The location would be in a special education class if they're getting pulled out of the general education classroom. In this case, we're saying the subject that the student needs this support in is math, so perhaps that's the area. In this case, that's the area of disability that the student is needing remediation and support. And then you would spell out the start and end dates in the IEP, so you'll know when the services are going to start and when they're going to end. The IEP runs for a year, so in this particular case, we have the class, the math support class, running from January to January. And it would also spell out how frequently the student is receiving that service. if it's a replacement class or something where they're receiving that instruction in a special setting for a particular subject, it's going to be the same amount of time that they would get that instruction if they were in a general education classroom. There's also a section for related services. As we talked about in the beginning, perhaps during that evaluation process, a student showed a need for speech and language therapy. So now you're going to explain how that speech and language is going to take place in this section of the IEP. If they qualified for speech and language or some other related service, it's because it's related to their disability. They're having some type of difficulty with the curriculum and with school, and they need that speech therapy or whatever related service it is in order to make progress in their educational program. So for example, if a student has language delays that are impacting their reading comprehension in the reading class, then they might need speech therapy. Just like in the program, everything is spelled out, the type of service, the location, the size of the grouping. Is the student in a small group? Is the student needing the service individually? And the start and end dates. And as well as the frequency and duration for the services. Extended school year is another portion of the IEP. If a student is in need of services during the summer when school is not in session, that's what the IEP team needs to consider at this point in the IEP meeting. So the types of information you consider, or the criteria you would consider, would be whether the student is going to significantly regress in skills and not be able to recoup the skills in a reasonable amount of time once they return to school. Another reason might be that they have an emerging skill. So a student may have struggled greatly over the course of the school year, and then towards the end of the school year they had a rapid improvement where we don't want to lose that momentum, then we might recommend an extended school year program. Or if the student has a significant disability that requires a lot of ongoing instruction in life skills and addressing that significant severe disability, then that might be another reason for extended school year. So not all students need an extended school year, but it's always considered. Again, just like every other component of a student's program, if they need this extended school year, it's going to be detailed in the IEP, how it will take place, the dates, the frequency, whether they need related services, all of those things will be considered. And then just underneath that section in the IEP is rationale for removal from general education. And
so this is so the rationale. What interventions have been put into place up until this point? Was it effective? Because you're not going to just remove a student out of general education to special education for no reason. You need to document what has been done up until this point. Is that working? If it's not working, then we're going to proceed with this continuum of services. So this continues on with the rationale of removal from education, general education. So, is the student remaining in general ed, is that more beneficial versus a student, going into special ed? Is it a harm to a student, to them, or to their peers? So all of that has to be spelled out in the IEP. The next section is a transition planning. So if a student is out of district, you need to document ways in which you are going to bring them back into district. Modifications to extracurricular and non-academic activities. All activities are available to the student, but do they need modifications with those extracurricular activities within the district? And it indicates, length of school day. Is it the same length as their peers? Are they out of district? Is that day longer? Is that day shorter? And so forth. So all that needs to be documented. And then transitioning from elementary to secondary program. So a statement needs to be indicating here if they're going from 5th grade over to middle school.
okay. The next section of the IEP has to do with participation in the state assessment program, which we're now administering the PARC assessments. And there's different subjects, so if there's the assessments in English language arts or math, a student may or may not need accommodations in either of those portions of the assessment. So for example, an accommodation might be getting extended time to complete the assessment. If a student needed that throughout the year for tests and for assignments, then that would also be provided during the park assessment. So there's a detailed amount of accommodations that a student might qualify for. Once you're at the IEP meeting, you can ask the child study team and your case manager to explain those to you and go through them with you and decide as a team if your child would need any accommodations. There's a small percentage of students who would not participate in the state assessment, and then at that point we would provide the alternate assessment for those students. Right now we're using the dynamic learning maps. So if a student's IEP goals and objectives are significantly modified from that of the general curriculum, they might qualify for this alternative assessment. And the idea is that you want to assess what they know and how they've been taught. So if the park isn't going to do that for these students and they qualify for this alternative assessment, we want to get the best information we can to inform our instruction. So the team would determine that that was the appropriate assessment. And graduation requirements. This would just be a section where we would talk about any exemptions that a student, once they're in high school, again, are there any things that are required of the general population that we would exempt a student from? For example, maybe there's a certain course that most students are required to take, but you might be exempt from it for some reason or another that student doesn't need that course, for example. That process begins again at age 14. So in Denville, we're a K-8 district, so all of these items that are high school, you will start talking about them typically in 8th grade, but whatever year your child turns 14.
So this is kind of going towards the end of the IEP. So it's all explained out here. What is the purpose of this meeting? Is it an initial meeting? Is it an annual review? Were there any options considered but rejected? As an example, were you discussing whether or not they should be in an in-class support setting versus a resource setting, and kind of why you came up with one decision versus another? And that's usually if you're kind of debating that, that needs to be documented. And what assessments determine that, what are the child's present levels, and were there any other factors relevant, to the proposed action? The transfer of rights is that when the student turns 18 years of age, all rights are transferred over to that child, and therefore the district must receive permission from the child to continue with assessments in the IEP when that child turns 18 years old. And your procedural safeguards, basically if you have any questions that a case manager is unable to answer, there's numbers you can contact, whether it's the Director of Special Services or the county supervisor or SPAN, or numbers that would be in the IEP if needed to go beyond the case manager. So kind of just some final points or facts. After you review the IEP, your child's initial or reevaluation, the IEP with your case manager, parental consent is needed in order for that IEP to be implemented. Again, that's your initial and your reevaluation. If it is your annual review IEP, you will be asked for consent. However, unless you put something in writing to the district, the IEP will go into effect 15 calendar days after the meeting is held, and that is just for annual review. So again, facts to remember. The IEP is a working fluid document. A parent can request a meeting at any time. It does not have to be at an annual review or reevaluation. You could hold a meeting and then a month later, if you wanted to meet again, you certainly can. The IEP can be changed at any time. Again, if you're reviewing it or things are not happening 2 months after the IEP, you can request a meeting and make changes for the IEP. And any amendments made to the current IEP will require parental consent. So if you want to make any changes to that IEP, parental consent needs to be taken in order to move forward.
Okay, So that's our IEP portion of the presentation, and I'm just going to go into the difference in terms of what a 504 accommodation plan is. So this is another way for a student with a disability to receive intervention or strategies or modifications in school, and I just want to explain the difference between when a student is eligible for an IEP versus when a student would be eligible for a 504 accommodation plan. The 504 accommodation plan got its name because of the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and this act does require districts to provide students with disabilities a 504 accommodation plan if they meet these requirements. So the student would have to have a mental or physical impairment, and that impairment must impact them in something in their life. So in the case of school, it's impacting their learning. And at that point, if the student does not need or meet the criteria for special education eligibility, they might meet the criteria for a 504 accommodation plan. And I'm just giving you an example of what might be a situation where a student would qualify for a 504 plan and maybe wouldn't need all of the different services and programs and everything that we just outlined in the IEP. So in this case, if a student, for example, had a diagnosis, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but the student did not require or need a special education program, but they did need, for example, some accommodations. Maybe the student needs some movement breaks, the student needs extra time for tests, maybe they need their attention to be refocused with some nonverbal prompts from the teacher. Those are all things that we could do in a general education classroom, and an accommodation plan would outline them and protect the student and ensure that those strategies are implemented in the classroom for the student. So if that was the only extent to what a student might need, that's just one example. But if they didn't need specialized programs and specialized related services and things like that, then an accommodation plan could meet their needs. In Denville, if your child has a documented disability, you can contact the school's 504 accommodation officer, and the 504 committee will work with you to develop an accommodation plan for your child. So those who might be on the committee, be a school administrator, yourself as a parent, child's teacher, the school nurse could possibly be involved, school counselor, and those different individuals would determine what types of accommodations your child needs. Your consent is required for this plan just as it is with an IEP, and like the IEP, it's a working document and it can be reviewed and revised based on your child's needs. So it's just more of an accommodation plan versus an overarching program. Those are the differences between the two different options for a student with a disability. And that concludes our presentation. We want to thank you all for coming, and